Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Ryan Pronzinski of Christ Lutheran Church, and this is my Chair Chats daily devotion for Thursday, May 7, 2020. These video devotionals are intended to help you engage your life of faith during this time of pandemic, and some of you might be getting back to worship soon. Many of you who are in my context still are unable to. And so with this idea of engaging one's life of faith in mind, I encourage you to take time throughout these videos to pause and reflect, journal, have conversation with those around you at home as you continue to shelter in place or at least social distance. I also encourage you to leave constructive comments and questions and prayer requests in the comments section below, and I promise that I will get to those comments and questions and prayer requests in the following videos, as I've done in the past. The readings that are used during these videos come from the Daily Revised Common Lectionary, which is a church calendar schedule and can be found online. The readings for today are Psalm 31, verses 1 through 5, and verses 15 through 16, Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, and Acts chapter 6, verses 8 through 15. These readings are listed below in the description. Before I get to the readings themselves, as always, I'd like to invite you to come and join us at Christ Lutheran Church for our online streaming of our worship service on Sunday. We do the live streaming on Sunday morning at 9:45 Eastern Standard Time, but you are able to watch these services anytime after they take place at our Facebook page video link section. And the link to those videos is in the description below. So please come and join us for worship. With that in mind, we start with our first reading, which comes from Psalm 31, verses 1 through 5, and verses 15 through 16, which reads as follows. In you, O Lord, I seek refuge. Do not let me ever be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. You are indeed my rock, my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. My times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and my persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. Here ends the reading. I didn't realize this until now as I read this on the video, that our last reading from Acts chapter 6 is actually reflected in this psalm. And I think you'll hear that about God's face shining in Stephen. And although Stephen is stoned and dies, the Lord delivers him into his hands, into his faithful hands in the life to come. So there's kind of a harmony there. So just going to duly note that. Now, getting back to the psalm itself, on my first read through, as I was reading through the psalm, I must admit that as I finished reading it, some of my own personal situation as pastor right now is honestly going to be reflected in this devotion. But I hope that as I reflect on my own personal situation, as I think about this psalm, that you'll be able to appreciate what either your pastor right here on this screen is going through, or other pastors around you as well during this time of pandemic, where it's really troubling and hard to think about how to safely and faithfully lead people during this time of pandemic and transition from shelter in place to some semblance of, quote unquote, opening things back up. And so for me, the first line that stands out is this, quote, "In you, O Lord, I seek refuge. Do not let me ever be put to shame." As decisions need to start getting made about what in-person worship might look like and when it might happen during this time of pandemic, because even as we are seemingly in a time of decline of the disease, we are still at its peak. It's at its peak in decline, but I want to stress that it's still at its peak and it's still a pandemic. The pandemic doesn't go away simply because we start the downslope and simply because things start to open back up. It's still a pandemic. And so as we start to make decisions about what opening looks like and when it happens, I am definitely worried personally about being attacked and criticized and being put to shame for the decisions that I am trying to talk through and work through with my leaders at the church. And this is especially true because of the political overtones in the national media. It's not the media's fault. It's the political leaders through the lens of the media, how we get our information, that's kind of being transplanted on this situation, right? Politics are being transplanted on what should simply be a public health and safety issue, period. There should be no partisanship about this at all. We should be looking at this scientifically and socially and faithfully, and how do we keep people healthy and safe, right? Especially in the church context. And then, of course, in other parts of the culture, how do people get back to work safely too? But none of that should have anything to do with political party, political affiliation, and yet a lot of that is being interjected, and it starts to muddy the waters. And so that opens one up to criticism and attack if it seems political, due to the way in which the situation is being talked about and reflected through the media. And so I am given hope today as I read this psalm, that in God I can always take refuge. And so for you, that means you can always take refuge too. Even if my decisions cause people to feel like shaming me, God will never be ashamed by me and the decisions I make, especially if they are done from a place and position of love and faith. So again, I say God will never shame me or shame you for taking actions and positions from a place of faithfulness and love, and for that I say thanks be to God. And so for you out there, you're going to have to make decisions too, in your own context and in your own way. So the decisions that you might make in the coming days might cause others to want to scoff at you and shame you. Kind of like Stephen when we get there in Acts chapter 6. And know that as you seek to live faithfully, because I know you will as you watch these, you wouldn't be watching these and reading your Bible and reflecting if you didn't seek to live faithfully. As you seek to do this, God will always be your refuge and will never put you to shame. Again, I say thanks be to God. Another line that I think is beautiful for all of us during this time of planning and transitioning during this pandemic is the verse which reads like this in verse 4, quote, "Take me out of the net that is hidden for me. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me." At a time when there are so many uncertainties right now, due to this pandemic, this virus, this COVID-19, and it can feel like there might be pitfalls and traps we don't see because of all these uncertainties. It is very assuring to know that God will save us from these traps. I think of this isn't in our readings, but if you know your Bibles, I think of Daniel in the lion's den, who is saved from that trap, or of Rashak, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel, who are saved from the fiery furnace. God will save us. God will save you from the time of trial. So what pitfalls then are you worried about tripping into in the coming days? What pitfalls are you worried about tripping into in the coming days? Or what pitfalls are you worried about others falling into in the coming days? Because maybe you're like, man, I know what I'm doing and I'm going to be safe, but I'm worried about other people. What are those worries? And then I'd have you ask, how has God seen you through times of trial in the past? Or maybe how have you seen God see others through times of trial in the past? And as you reflect on these worries and how God has delivered you in the past, kind of like Daniel and Rashak, Meshach, and Abednego, how might remembering these times that you've been delivered from trial by God help you right now? Right? And how might it help you see how God's doing that for you now? And lastly, from the psalm, I want you to know this. God is never faltering for you. That's the whole point of this psalm. God never falters for you. God's love for you is steadfast, even when others' love may not be. And again, to that I say thanks be to God. All right, on to Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, which reads as follows. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great so that you are a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Here ends the reading. So these verses from Genesis, they take on a whole new meaning, at least for me, I hope for you, during this time of pandemic, right? As we, too, are being called by God on our own unfamiliar journey, like Abram's about to start in this reading, in a direction we've never gone before. None of us have lived through a pandemic before, to a place that is foreign and unclear. What does it look like to try and get back to life during time of pandemic, when we can no longer shelter in place all the time everywhere? We, like Abram, were very comfortable with the way things were. Abram's life was fine. He wasn't like, oh, please, somebody save me from this horrid life that I'm living. No, he was doing his thing and he was fine. And then God calls him to a different place. Just like Abram, our life was fine. For Abram, God's voice is specifically what called Abram to a new place. From this, familiar place in a way of being to a new place. For us, it's the voice of the pandemic and a voice of disease, and God's voice alongside this pandemic and disease that is calling us to a new place. And so please keep in mind that as we are journeying, just like Abram in Genesis today, the beginning of God's good news, because this is the very beginning of it all. The overarching narrative and story of the Bible, of even Jesus Christ himself, starts with Abram in Genesis chapter 12. Keep in mind that the beginning of God's good news and the story of blessing that culminates in the person of Jesus Christ given for us starts with a journey of uncertainty and fear. Just like our own lives today, we are on a journey of uncertainty and fear. And this is how God's story of blessing begins in the Bible. What a hopeful reminder that from the very beginning, God's blessings come through our fearful journeys, even when we don't know where we are going and we have no idea how we're going to get there. There's also caution, though, for us in Abram's story as well, especially as people of the United States of America in the year 2020, where instant gratification is a thing and we struggle to be patient. Remember that the promise of blessing in getting to the end of our journey might very well take longer than we think or we would like it to. for the promise of blessing that is given to Abram in this reading today, to be a great nation, means you need to have descendants, you need to have children, right? When this blessing was given to Abram, and I looked in my Bible, I verified this, the blessing was first, or the promise was first given to Abram to have children at 75 years old. However, this promise of having a child, his own child, with Sarai, his wife, did not come to take place until Abram, then known as Abraham, was 100 years old. So it took 25 years for this promise to come to fulfillment. So God working out blessings over an extended period of time is nothing new. And that's the situation we live in right now. We too want to find ourselves in a place of promise and blessing. But oftentimes, God's blessings take time. And so in Abram, we are reminded that God works blessings out through our journeys, but that might take some time. They might take quite some time. You know, people, the epidemiologists and experts right now are, conservatively saying it's probably going to take 18 to 24 months before things get back to normal, whatever that means. And so 2 years is in our time quite a while. When before all this really started ramping up, we were thinking, maybe it'll just be about a month or so. And now we're in like month 2, looking to go into, at least in my context, month 3 of things being dramatically different, and that's just the beginning. But remember, in the end of this story of God's blessing, in not just Abram's life, but in our life, because we are all the families of the earth, as mentioned today. In the end, even when we lose faith, like Abram and Sarai do multiple times throughout their life, and if we begin to, like them, wonder if God is in fact going to keep God's promises, because they did, right? The end of the story says God keeps God's promises, even 25 years later, even thousands of years later, because God said, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And Jesus is of Abraham's family. And it is through Jesus that, in fact, all of creation is blessed. So thousands of years later, God keeps God's promises. So we need not fret that just because it's been a long time and we doubt and we don't think that God will keep God's promises. God is faithful, just as the psalmist said today. So no matter how long it takes, God will be your refuge, save you from the pitfalls, bless you and keep you, even if you struggle to keep the faith. So you and all your struggles and your journeys to unfamiliar places in unfamiliar ways are all a part of God's story of blessing for you. And it's been this way from the very beginning. So if you feel like you're journeying, you're fearful, and you're not quite sure how God's going to keep God's promises and bless you, welcome to God's story. You fit right in with pretty much every other character, including this one right here, who is feeling that way right now. And so I hope you find comfort in this psalm and in this story from Genesis of Abram, as I have today. And with long journeys and blessings from God in mind, I ask, what's the longest you have had to wait for something good in your life? What's the longest you have had to wait for something good in your life? And what blessings did you discover on the way while you waited for this thing that you had to wait for? And then when you finally did get the thing you were waiting for, how did your appreciation for that thing, that something, change as you waited for it and then finally received it? So at first I couldn't think of anything, so I'll share kind of generic things of what this might look like. Because I imagine there are people out there that have had family members that have gone on deployment, and you have had to wait patiently for your loved one to come home, and you were uncertain when or even if they would. There are people who have had to wait for organ transplants. There are people who have been maybe, something a little bit more simple, but still meaningful, put on a waiting list for tickets to go to a concert or a show. That doesn't happen very often, right? How does waiting help you appreciate it differently? What blessings did you discover along the way? Then I finally thought of one. So I'm a bowler. I like to go bowling. I've been on a league many years of my life and have been for the past 4 here. And I started, I think, at around 8 years old, but it wasn't until I was 18 that I bowled my first 300 game. And so it took 10 years. 10 years of league play and tournaments and practice on my own, of thinking, at one point in time that just bowling a 180 was like the world's greatest thing, to then getting to the point where, anything short of a 200 now, and not even that, like a 220, my average is about 215. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. Getting that first 300 after 10 years at 18 was a moment I will never forget. It was spectacular. And I got to share it with my dad, who taught me how to bowl, and my brother, who bowled with me often. And the way in which it happened, I don't even need to get into all the details still, is something I remember clearly and vividly, and as I think of it, it brings me joy to this day. And so sometimes patience and waiting is part of the joy of the journey. And so as we wait and we journey, and you wait and you journey, to get the blessing that you're waiting for, I hope that, one, you discover joy along the way, and then when you finally do find yourself in the place where you trust that God has desired to bring you, that the joy is even greater because of the wait. All right, so on to Acts 6, verses 8 through 15, which reads as follows. Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and others from Cilicia and Asia, stood up and argued with Stephen. But they could not withstand the wisdom of the Spirit, or the wisdom and the Spirit with which Stephen spoke. Then they secretly instigated some men to say, quote, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." They stirred up the people as well as the elders and the scribes. Then they suddenly confronted Stephen, seized him, and brought him before the council. They set up false witnesses who said, quote, "This man never stopped saying things against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses handed to us." And all who sat in the council looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. Here ends the reading. So here we just have a part of the story of Stephen, who is the first Christian martyr. In many ways, Stephen embodies the risen Jesus, right, as Jesus' witness, which is exactly what Jesus said would happen at the beginning of Acts. He commissions those who follow him. Go therefore, I'm thinking Matthew. He does say, "And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to all the ends of the earth," in Acts 1. And here we see Stephen embodying that promise, really. Like Jesus, Stephen does wonders and signs that make people jealous And so they slander and seek to kill him. If you read the Gospel of Luke, which is kind of the first part of Acts, Luke and Acts go together. Same thing happens to Jesus in his life. Now it's happening to Stephen. And so in that way, Stephen, in his very bones, in his very life, bears witness to who Jesus is. But even as Stephen is slandered, people who see him see the face of an angel. It's beautiful. So even though people pile on these words of slander onto the faithful Stephen, loving Stephen, doing signs and wonders, pointing to Jesus, for that is what a sign is. It points to something, and in the case of a follower of Jesus, a sign points to Jesus. Even in the face of all this slander, people still see the face of an angel when they look at Stephen. And so I wonder in the coming days then, as we as people of faith make decisions and do things with regard to COVID-19 and how we live our lives, will our actions, like Stephen, point to Jesus? Right? I wonder if people will be amazed at our patience and compassion and resiliency, while others seek to slander us because they feel shamed that they are not acting the way we are. And I wonder, as we act in faithful ways and seek to point to Jesus and his love and be as Jesus for the people around us in the world, that, and we act in ways that other people in the world are not going to like because they feel bad, they feel shamed, right? Because they're not doing it. I wonder that in this process, as we get bad-mouthed for doing the right things, because other people feel shamed by it or fearful by it, because they don't understand how they can't act in that way too, that even as people might say bad things about us, that when they look at our face and they look at what we do, will they too see the face of an angel? Will they too encounter the divine through our actions, even when the words of the people around us say otherwise? Or, this is the alternative, will we be like the angry people who simply want things to be the way they were and put the angels that God sends us to death, like Stephen? Right? Will we just be angry and bitter and scream and rant and rave and just say, we just need to get back to the way things were? And in the process, either overlook or put the angels that God sends us to death. Now, especially that last wonderment, if these wonderments seem a bit salty today, that's just where I'm at this day. I am stressed. I am well, but I am stressed. I am blessed, but I am stressed. Because it's just hard right now, wondering how to do things faithfully and safely at a time when there's not a lot of unity on what that looks like. So I'll end by saying this, with taking actions that might upset people or even potentially be sinful. Thanks be to God for Jesus, right? And the forgiveness we are given freely. The forgiveness which you are given freely, even as you make decisions that might be seen as others by sinful or by yourself. Because this forgiveness is the thing which frees us to act and not be bound in fear to do nothing, right? This forgiveness frees us to act and trust, knowing that even if we are wrong, or even if a part of what we're doing is wrong, is sinful, we too will receive these words from Jesus and from Stephen that come at the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts, right? Where Jesus says from the cross, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they're doing." And Stephen says, embodying Jesus in Acts, "Do not hold this sin against them." Do not hold this sin against them. So God bless you as you ponder how to point to Jesus and his love in your life with the choices you make and the way you conduct yourself in the coming days, weeks, and months as we transition a little bit during this time of pandemic. And with all that in mind, as this video's gotten a little long, I will say sorry for the late post. I was busy this morning, but I will talk to you tomorrow.